Welcome everyone to the horror planet. The swamp I've lived in all my life is not a big place. It has no name, no fame. The locals call it the swamp, though that's not true. This is a city. It's like a swamp, though always damp, always gray. The smell of salt in the air is so strong it sticks to your skin. The clouds never leave us. The rain never stops, and mold creeps into everything. On the walls, the boats, even the old wooden houses. That's just life here. You don't read it. You live by it. Most people live by fishing. It's been that way for centuries. No big offices, no fancy schools. Just boats and nets and the ocean. That's the honest life, even if it's hard. Take what you can and trade it in the city. If you're lucky, you'll get enough bread, some beer, and maybe a coat for the winter. If not, tighten your belt and try again the next day. Me? I'm a part-time fisherman and a part-time tourist boatman. I'll take you on a trip on the water, those of you who are curious enough to visit this place. There's nothing beautiful here. No golden beaches, no clear skies. Just gray rain and black waves. But every now and then someone shows up, drawn to the stories. Spirits, monsters, curses. Everyone loves a good scare, right? People come with their cameras, laptops, and gadgets. They ask about history, strange stories that the locals never talk about. They always dig, but something always happens to them. I'm just a fisherman. I don't have the answers they're looking for, and I'm not trying to stop them. My job is simple. Take them on a boat ride, point out the sights, share the safe parts of the stories, and bring them back. What they do next is their business. I've seen enough to know better, though. Live here long enough and you'll learn the rules. Rules aren't written on paper, they're felt in your bones. A face that whispers. If you're smart, follow them. If you're not, you won't last long. Take children, for example. They don't play outside after dark. No one has to tell them, they just know. The same goes for fishermen. There's a stretch of water to the west where we don't fish. No one explains why. We just don't do it. There is a church in town, a rotten little thing with a leaning tower. The door isn't locked yet, but no one comes in. Never. People like me don't ask questions about these things. Questions are for tourists. I've lived here long enough to know the answers aren't worth it. Best not to dig too deep. This place is not for the curious. I remember a boy from the big city with a camera and a tape recorder. He asked me about the news, the church, the Western waters. I told him what I tell everyone. These are just stories. There's nothing to see here. But he won't let that happen, and he kept wandering around, asking questions of the old ones, sneaking into places he shouldn't go. A week later, he was gone. He left town at midnight, or so people said. No one saw him leave. His car sat outside the hotel for days. Then one morning, he wasn't there. He had just left as if he had never been here. People don't talk about it. They just shrug their shoulders and walk away. That's the way it is around here. This town has its own roads. Roads that don't overlap. Tourists think they are searching for a lost supernatural treasure that keeps them up at night. They think this place is like all the others they have read about on the internet. But it is not. They don't understand. The stories are not dangerous. This is the same place. This city does not like strangers. Can hardly stand people who have lived here their whole lives. You put your head down. Follow the rules. Don't pay attention. You'll survive. But I'm just a fisherman. What do I know about that? I'll take my boat out, haul in what I can, and bring it back. When tourists come, I show them around, tell them what they want to hear, and then drop them off at the dock. Nothing more, nothing less. That's the honest life, even if it's not always easy. Yet after all these years, I can't help but feel that there's something about this place that I'll never understand. Something waiting in the corners where the light doesn't reach. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe it's better not to know. If you ever find yourself in this place, you do well to listen carefully. There are rules here and stories associated with them, and breaking any of them is a mistake you can't make twice. The first rule is simple. Don't swim where the lights are off. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, faint glowing balls appear deep underground. Fishermen call them dead lights. They're not fish or jellyfish. They're something else. Some say they're drowned spirits, trapped in the darkness, luring the living to join them. There is no warning before they appear. At some point, the water looks normal. Then these lights flash far below. Yellow, green, white, it doesn't matter. When you see them, you're out. It doesn't matter if you're mid-dive or in the middle of a spin. Once the dead light appears, you're out. If not, you're not going at all. People tell stories of falling lights, warnings passed down through the generations. There was a fisherman's wife who swore that her husband would be pulled out that night when the water was as smooth as glass. His boat was found sunk, the nets full, but there was no sign of him, just a faint light where his boat had been. Or a man who disappeared swimming far from shore. Others said a light shone beneath him before he sank like a stone. A few days later, he washed up on shore, lifeless and cold, his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. Some say the dead lights are the spirits of those who died at sea, angry and jealous of the living. Others believe it is the ocean itself playing tricks on him to get more life. I don't know which is true, but I've seen dead lights myself and I know it's best not to test them. The guy who ran these tours before me told me a story once. It happened one summer years before I started. He had a tourist on the boat with him, a 30-something confident, carefree guy. The tourist wanted to swim in the ocean for the thrill. The old man had warned him not to do it, that it was not safe to swim at night, but the tourist just laughed, said the old man was being dramatic, and jumped in anyway. The old man sat, his jaw clenched, staring into the water. He did not trust them, not at night, not in these parts. Then he saw them, dead lights. Glowing balls flickered faintly below the surface, just below the tourist. He shouted at the boy to get out and ordered him to go up the stairs. But the tourist laughed again. Then the laughter stopped. The old man says the tourist froze in the water and his face changed instantly. His eyes widened as if he saw something no one else could. He looked down and then left. No splash, no sound. He was gone. The water was silent and the dead lights went out as if they had never been there. The body was washed ashore a few days later. I learned his lesson and never took anyone out after dark again. It wasn't worth the risk. The sea is as cruel as it is beautiful, and the dim lights were proof of that. Rule number 2. Always wear earwax when passing by Salt Rock. This place is a stretch of rocks that jut out of the water like broken bones. The rocks are sharp enough to shatter a boat's hull in seconds, and wreckage litters the area like broken toys. This is a place you should avoid unless you absolutely have to get close. The danger isn't just in the rocks. It's what you can't see. Salt Rock is home to mermaids. No, they're not from the beautiful fairy tales. You can't see them, but you can hear them. It starts with a low humming sound that you feel in your bones before you hear it. The closer you get, the louder the sound gets. It doesn't hit you all at once. It comes to you softly at first, like a lullaby on the wind. But if you let it settle in your mind, if you listen to it long enough, it's gone. The siren song draws you to the rocks, like a moth to a fire. You think that's the most beautiful sound you've ever heard. Before you know it, your boat will sink and you'll drown. That's why we use candles. All fishermen carry it, a soft, sticky substance to make sounds. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. I always keep a pocket knife and a piece of clay on the boat. If you see me walking out, you'll notice that I stop at the dock to put my ear in before I approach it. I had a tourist with me once, a man in his 50s. He had been reading about mermaids on the internet and didn't believe in the old fishermen's tales. He wanted to see the ship sink. He threw money at me, but I told him bluntly, "I'm not going there and you shouldn't go either." He found another boat, someone desperate for money. I don't know what happened there. When he got back to his boat, it wasn't on him. The man who took him didn't say a word. He simply tied up the boat, got into his truck, and left town. The The salt rock has been like this for so long no one can remember. The rocks remain sharp, the shipwrecks pile up, the sirens remain hungry. No one has ever tried to clear the debris or find a safe path. It's not worth it. You leave it alone as with everything else here. This place is full of dangers, but they're not hidden. They're out in the open. You just need to know how to spot them. The rules aren't complicated, but they're unforgiving. Break them and the sea will remind you who's really in charge. Next rule for fishermen: always check your lines. You think rope is just rope. Simple stuff, nothing special. But here, ropes are lifesavers. They hold your nets, secure your boat, and make sure your catch doesn't drift away. Without them, you're not only losing traction, you're putting yourself at risk. So we check the knots, the lines, the fibers. We don't take chances. But sometimes, no matter how careful you are, the lines just don't last. Fishermen talk about their lines being frayed or frayed, and their ends marked with little jagged teeth. The ancients called the criminals rope biters. No one ever saw them, but the signs were always the same. Nets floating, traps falling, and a clean bite on the thickest line. Rope biters are the reason we check every knot before we set out and why we don't use cheap lines. Some fishermen even have rituals. My uncle would spit on the knots before he threw them overboard and would swear to you he was pulling the line out. Others sprinkle salt on the nets to bless the lines. Me? I just double-check my lines, sometimes triple-check them, before I go out. It works so far. Then there's the hair tradition. Many fishermen here grow their hair long, not for style but for the sea. Old-timers believe that giving the sea a piece of you keeps it from taking you all. They tie strands of hair into knots and throw them into the sea as an offering. They say this keeps the critters down below at bay and gives them something to keep from following your boat. My father taught me how to tie the lines properly so they wouldn't come undone before sinking. At first it was silly, like playing on an old fable. But one fine day when I forgot, my boat wouldn't stop turning. No matter how tightly I tied the anchor, it still broke. And I never forgot it after that. Call it a coincidence if you like, but I wouldn't risk anything. Some young people laugh at it and call it an old women's tale. But they'll learn. Here, ignoring the old ways doesn't end well. And there's the salt line. That's different. It doesn't happen often, maybe a few times in a fisherman's life. But when it does, it will stay in your memory forever. On foggy days, sometimes a faint white line appears on the water. It stretches beyond the horizon, as if someone took chalk and drew it in the ocean. In ancient times, it was called the salt line. They say it's a boundary, a line between our world and something else. Crossing it will take you into waters from which you can't return. The waters beyond the salt line are no longer part of our world. They're something else. And once there, they're gone forever. I remember hearing about a lost boat when I was a kid. A small fishing crew of 3 men had disappeared into the fog. A few days later, their boat was spotted approaching the salt line. Some of the fishermen swore they saw the crew calling for help, but no one came. They knew better. The boats that crossed the salt line are no longer alive. The wood looks very old, very rotten, but the boats still float. And the people, if you can call them that, don't look good either. They are pale, as if they have been underwater for a long time, and their movements are quick and erratic. If you ever see a boat with a salt line, turn around. Don't back away. Don't scream. Don't come near. And if someone prevents you from getting out of a boat, ignore them. They are dead, even if they don't know it yet. I have only seen a salt line once. Early one day, in a fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, I saw it. A thin white line across the water. It wasn't very visible, just a faint glint, but the sight of it made my stomach drop. I cast the nets faster than ever and turned the boat over. It didn't matter that the capture wasn't over. I didn't stop to see what was on the other side. On the way back, I thought I saw something in the fog. The shadow of a boat, probably near the salt line. I didn't slow down to check. It didn't seem like much, just kept going. When I told the other fishermen what I'd seen, They nodded as if it was nothing new. One of them patted me on the back and told me I did the right thing. I haven't been out in the fog since. If he comes while I'm on the water, I go right back. The sea knows its secrets. I don't need to know them. The last rule is the simplest, but perhaps the most important. Never go near the lighthouse. He sits on a barren island, a solitary black shape on the horizon. Nothing grows there. No trees, no grass, no stubborn plants clinging to the rocks everywhere. The island is dead. Even the birds avoid it, flying miles away. So do the fishermen. You have to be desperate or stupid to come near. The lighthouse has been deserted all my life. No one talks about why. Some say the keeper disappeared without a trace one night. Others argue that the lighthouse was never intended to guide ships. Whatever the truth, everyone agrees that it is cursed. Don't go there, don't look long, and don't trust the light if it comes on. The light shouldn't be on. There's no one there to operate it. The dock was dilapidated and the only boat big enough for the voyage had sunk years ago. But sometimes late at night the light still shines, cuts through the fog, sharp and searching, as if it were searching for someone. If you had binoculars, you might notice strange objects scattered around the island. A red backpack, a yellow notebook, a pair of sneakers, a hairbrush, something small that doesn't belong. People say these are the possessions of those who drowned or disappeared near the lighthouse. Tourists first and foremost, people who didn't know any better or thought they could handle it. When I first saw the light, I was 15. It was late, it was already getting dark, and I was sitting on the pier with my friends, watching the waves. The rain had passed and the silence was heavy, as it sometimes is here. Then came the light. It was dim at first, barely visible in the fog. Then it grew brighter, gliding back and forth in the water. Daniel joked that the lighthouse was coming to life. He laughed, but there was tension in his voice. No one said anything. We just watched. Finally, Jimmy stood up, the older boy who was already working on the fishing boats. He didn't hesitate. He told us to look away and took my hand and pulled me to my feet. Jimmy had an authority we didn't know we had. None of us asked him. We followed him into town in silence. When we got there, he told us plainly, we were never to speak of what we had seen. He warned us that the light was not something to be trusted. And this wasn't led by anyone. This was a deception of theirs. I didn't understand what he meant then, but I do now. A lighthouse doesn't guide you to safety, it pushes you. And if you follow it, you'll never come back. There are many stories of people who didn't listen. Like the couple who thought the lighthouse was romantic. They hired a small boat and set off, ignoring all warnings. When the fog set in, they disappeared. A few days later, their boat was found floating near the lighthouse. It was empty. Then there was a local who decided to camp on the island. He said these stories were an old myth. He set off with a tent and supplies, determined to prove that he was not afraid of anything. By morning, his boat had washed up on the beach. He didn't have it. All he found was his flashlight, lying on the sand with dead batteries. I saw the light several times later that night on the dock. I didn't look directly at it anymore. I turned away, focused on something else, and waited for it to go away. It always does this. No one knows why it happens. Some say the lighthouse has a mind of its own and lights up when it senses someone is nearby. Others believe it is a signal, a way to summon something to the island. Whatever the reason, the rule remains the same. Do not approach it. Let the lighthouse stand alone and forgotten. There are enough dangers at sea without adding this to the list. And if you ever see a light shining in the fog, just remember, no one controls this lighthouse. Whatever that light shines upon, it is not human. I have one last story to tell about how I lost my right hand. I don't share it often, but if you want to understand the rules, their true weight, you need to know. It happened on a gray summer day years ago, if we can call it tourist season. This town doesn't get many visitors. but from time to time strangers pass by. They are easy to spot: clean clothes, wide eyes, as if they were looking at a painting rather than a real place. That summer there were more of them than usual. That sometimes happens when stories about a place spread too much. Rumors arouse curiosity and suddenly people want to see it. It was good at first. It always is. We sold more fish. The souvenir shop had its best month in years. And even the bar was noisier, filled with strangers swapping exaggerated tales of the place. In a town like this, noise is a necessity, so no one complained. But peace never lasts here. Not for long. One family stood out among the tourists. A mother, a father, and a teenage son. They looked pretty ordinary, middle-class, shiny sneakers, decent car. People who would choose a cheap fishing town over a luxury resort for an authentic experience. They rented a small hotel room and stayed there for a week. The parents were hesitant, walking on the beach and taking pictures, but boy was he different. He was a college student studying marine biology, and you could tell he loved it. I heard an old man tell me he wanted to work with sharks or coral someday. There are big dreams for a place like this. But what really got him excited were the stories of sea monsters. He absorbed all the tales of dead lights, sirens, and sunken ships like a child opening Christmas presents. His questions came fast and furious. What do the fishermen think about the dead lights? Were the sirens real? Did any of you see boats pass the salt line? Looking back, the signs were clear. The curiosity, the questions, the way his eyes lit up when he looked at someone with humor. But in that moment, it just felt nice, flatter even. When you've spent your life in a forgotten city, it's easy to let your guard down when someone shows interest in you. The boy spent his days drawing boats or writing in a little leather notebook. He didn't bother anyone, so no one asked him to leave. When he wasn't drawing, he was talking to sailors and fishermen as if they were old friends. He made special mention of the lighthouse, though he didn't say so directly. But I noticed that his questions always came back to it. How far has anyone ever sailed? Has anyone been to the lighthouse? What does the light mean? Most of the fishermen sent him away, but some were funny and gave him the usual warning. Don't come near, don't trust the light, the island is cursed. They said it like you would warn a child not to touch a hot stove. He laughed, calling it folklore, but his curiosity only grew. By the end of the week, the family scene had become familiar. The parents had their routines, and the boy would stop by the dock, ask questions, draw. Some of the fishermen were impressed, saying he reminded them of their own children when they were full of questions instead of complaints. I can't blame them for not seeing it. Curiosity can seem harmless, but curiosity is dangerous in this city. It becomes too much and you stop seeing rules as rules. You start thinking of them as challenges. I've seen it happen. Tourists think stories are just stories, and locals become too trusting. It never ends well. The day everything changed started out like any other day. Gray sky, light rain, weather so ordinary that we hardly notice it. I was getting ready for a tour with some tourists, on a slow morning when the water is heavier, as if it holds a secret. I didn't think much of it. When I got back to the dock, the family was there. The parents waved politely, but the boy wasn't with them. I thought he was drawing or worried about old times. It wasn't until the evening, when the fog began to gather, that I realized I hadn't seen him all day. It wasn't an unusual trip for tourists, but something confused me. I pushed him away and told myself he was fine, probably back at the hotel. But deep down I knew better. There were signs and I ignored them. I didn't know yet what it would cost me. When evening came, I knew something was wrong. The boy's parents rushed into the bar, their faces pale and tense. The mother held a piece of paper in her hand and was shaking so badly she could barely hold it. His father's jaw was clenched, his expression somewhere between fear and anger. They asked me if anyone had seen their son, and I felt a weight lift from my chest. There was no sign of the boy all day. Not from me, not from the other hunters, not from anyone. That alone was bad enough. But then his mother opened the note she was carrying and read it aloud, her voice shaking. It said that afternoon he had gone out to Salt Rock. Salt Rock. Of all the places he could have gone, why there? It didn't make sense at first, until I thought of all the questions he was asking, all the stories he couldn't stand. He wasn't just interested in the sea. He was curious about its secrets, something no one dared touch. And now it seemed he had gone looking for them. My mother was on the verge of tears, and I saw the panic in her eyes. My father seemed calmer on the outside, but I could see that too, the helplessness hidden behind his stern expression. They were scared, and they had every reason to be. I don't have children of my own, but I've always had a soft spot for them. They remind me of a time when life was simpler, before I knew what the sea could do. So when I learned where the boy had gone, I didn't think twice. I told my parents to stay at the bar, where it was warm and dry and where they would be safe. The last thing I needed was for them to go out there themselves and cause more trouble. The other fishermen started whispering to each other as soon as their parents got to shore. I could hear their voices echoing through the bar. They weren't going after the boy, not on Salt Rock. I heard what they were saying, how the sea had been so rough lately, and how going out there would be a waste of time. But the child is there, I said. No one answered. They just looked at me, embarrassed. But none of them moved. Not one. Many of them looked at their drinks, avoiding my eyes. Others looked at their parents who were sitting silently in the corner, their mother still holding that piece of paper. No one offered to come with me. Their silence said it all. I didn't have time to argue. I turned and left. If no one else would help me, I would do it myself. The first thing I did was take out a knife and cut off a few long strands of hair. I tied it in knots, as my father had taught me, my hands working fast and steady. I cut to the sea. A small display, a distraction. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Then I stuffed the extra wax into my bag. The Salt Rock was not a destination unprepared. The sirens there didn't care who you were or why you came. They would have drowned you anyway if you weren't careful. The wax was my best defense, and I couldn't do without it. Finally, I moved to the ropes, double-checking every knot and line, then a third time to be sure. The sea was rough, and I couldn't afford to make a mistake. Whether I bit the line or not, I had to hold my lines. If I didn't, I was lost like a boy. When everything was ready, I pulled my boat out of the dock and boarded the ship. I started the engine and headed straight for Salt Rock. The wind was cold on my face and the spray hurt my skin, but I didn't stop. There were jagged cliffs ahead, their sharp edges jutting out of the sea. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and headed toward the darkening horizon. It didn't take long to reach Salt Rock, but every minute felt like an eternity. The waves were rough, the wind howling as if it wanted to throw me off the rudder. Pressing the wax hard into my ears, I scanned the water around the rocks. The rocks protruded like spears, dark and sharp, the broken boats tied to them looking like skeletons. I called his name over and over, my voice echoing against the roar of the sea. The crashing waves were deafening, even when the wax muffled the sound. I screamed at the top of my lungs, hoping he would hear me and call out to me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. Something in the water, a tail or maybe a wing. There was a heartbeat, and then it was gone. Then I remembered my father's words. He had told me long ago that if you wanted something back from the sea, anything that had already been taken, you had to give something back. The sea doesn't give for free, he had told me once. I had always thought it was just another one of his stories, but now those words were my only hope. I stopped screaming and stood on the edge of the boat, looking out into the dark waves. I know you have it. I gave it back to him. He's just a baby, I told him. The sea didn't respond. The waves crashed, the wind howled. My father said the sea might listen, but only if I gave it something. I took a deep breath, stopped rocking the boat, and spoke again. What do you want? What will it take to get him back? The waves didn't stop, but something changed. It wasn't something I could see or hear, just the change in the air, as if the sea were taking my words into account. And then, There was a faint thud from the side of the boat. I leaned over and saw it. A piece of wood, smooth and pale from years of water. There it was, tapping gently on the hull, as if it had been waiting for me. I lifted it carefully and turned it over in my hand. At that moment I saw it, scratched into the surface, in squiggly letters that seemed rather sharp, was a single word, hand. I stared at it for a moment, the weight of what it meant sinking inside me like a leaden anchor. Mermaids are greedy creatures. They do not trade lightly, and when they ask for something, they accept no substitutes. I knew there was no point in offering anything else. It was either my hand or nothing. I looked out at the dark water, imagining the boy's pale face beneath it, his lungs filling with seawater, his life fading away with every passing moment. I had no time to think about this. There was no time to argue, no time to hesitate. I looked down at my right hand, which was resting on the edge of the boat, my index finger slightly bent from my grip on the rudder. And at that moment I knew what I had to do. I reached for the knife attached to my belt. The blade was sharp. I had kept it that way to cut ropes, and it glowed dimly in the gray light. I clenched my teeth and placed the knife above my wrist, took a deep breath and held my head. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but I didn't stop. I cut it off and watched my hand fall into the water. The sea swallowed it instantly, the waves sweeping it away as if it had never been there. With my left hand, acting on instinct, I grabbed the rope and tied it tightly around the trunk to stop the bleeding. The knot was strong, and then everything stopped. The waves, the wind, even the air itself seemed to stop and hold its breath. Then I heard a faint, dull sound beside my boat, and there he was, a boy. His face was pale, his hair tied back, but he was alive. He was pounding the hull with one fist, his other hand gripping the edge, trying to hold it back. I grabbed him with my left hand and pulled him to the deck with all the strength I had left. He fell, coughing for air, seawater pouring from his mouth. I fell to my knees beside him, relieved, even though my arm ached. He was alive. Somehow, in spite of all the odds, he was alive. I forced myself to my feet and got back to the wheel. It wasn't easy to steer the boat with one hand, but I managed. I steered the boat toward the shore and pushed the engine as hard as I could. The waves bucked with every step, but I held on. The boy's breathing was shallow and I knew he wasn't safe yet. His lungs were full of water and his body was weak. I had to get him back quickly. When we reached the dock, other fishermen were waiting for us. They pulled the boy out and took him to his parents, who were crying with relief. His mother held him tight, her tears soaking his shirt, while his father stood with his hand on his shoulder. The boy and I were taken to the hospital miles away. He survived barely. The doctors said that if I had been there for even a minute, he would not have survived. As for my arm, they did everything they could. My knot stopped the bleeding, but I knew I would never be the one they wanted. The boy's parents thanked him constantly, their words flowing in a torrent of gratitude. I didn't say much in return. There wasn't much to say. I did what I had to do and paid the price. That's how it works with the sea. Don't take anything too seriously. Well, it's been a long time since then. The kids call me Captain Hook now. I'm not against it. It's kind of cute in a childish way. I let them call me that, and sometimes I even play with them. I do look a bit like a pirate, I admit it. I have my long hair tied back on one side, though it is now mostly gray. I smoke a joint when I am on the quay, where the smell of tobacco mingles with the salt air. My coat is old and torn in places, and my face looks the same, worn and rough, like a tree washed by the waves. And of course, there is the walnut. It is nothing special, just a slight bend in the metal where my hand has been, but it shines well and does the job. I learned to work with it quickly. I can now tie knots, haul nets, steer the boat, and even carve wood just like I used to. Life doesn't stop because you lose a part of yourself. You adapt. You move on. After that day, everything went back to normal. The boy lived, but I never saw him or his family again after he got out of the hospital. Once, when he graduated from college, he sent me a postcard. "Good kid. The sea hasn't changed much, and neither has the city. It's raining again. The clouds are still low, and the air still smells of salt. Mold clings to the walls, as if trying to reclaim the city piece by piece. The fishermen still go out every day, and the tourists still wander around telling the same old stories. The dead lights, the salt line, the salt rock, the lighthouse, they're all still here, waiting for someone to forget the rules. I still warn every tourist who enters the city. Some listen, some don't. It's not my job to make them believe, just to tell them what they need to know. I share my stories wherever I can, on a boat, by a fire, over a drink in a bar. Stories bring people here to life. They teach the rules in a way that remains constant, even if one doesn't realize it. They make you think twice before taking risks you don't understand. Life goes on. It's always like this, silent and defiant. The sea doesn't care what we've lost or the scars we carry. Keeps on moving, wave after wave, wave after wave. All we can do is move with it. So if you ever find yourself in a small coastal town called the Swamp, though it's not really a swamp, it would be a good idea to follow the rules. They're simple, but they're unforgivable. Don't swim where the lights are off. Don't exceed the salt line. Always wear a candle and don't go to the lighthouse. Most importantly, never go near Salt Rock. The sea has its ways, and it doesn't matter whether you understand them or not. But if you respect them, if you follow the rules, you may live long enough to tell the tale. And so the story ends. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video, share it, and comment on it. Don't forget to activate the bell so that you will receive a logo in the next story coming soon.